Now there you are. Show slates. Now I've shown slates. Now yesterday will I move this microphone? No, I can't move it. Look, it'll have to do. Yeah, I'm no technician and I have no technical crew here, so we have to live with it. Now last night I gave you what I shall call the physical description of Lower King Street and environs. But when I finished that, I thought, well, look, I've given the physical description, but I haven't really given the colour. And be assured that Lower King Street had colour, plenty of colour. Now, I don't think Charleville should be judged by that, because I'm sure that other parts of town were, well, you might say, relatively devoid of colour. If you use the Lower King Street area as the standard, I think the rest of the town must have been a fairly colourless place. All the colour seemed to be around us, and so I thought I'd give you some notion of the colour. You've read Dickens, and you know that Dickens has some characters fairly well fleshed out. You know, you've got Pip and you've got David Copperfield and you've got all of that crowd. But, you know, in that world, or that world was peopled with all sorts of curious people, you know, bizarre behaviour, bizarre characteristics. Well, that was what, it was the bizarre characteristics, of course, that were, in a sense, what gave the colour to Lower King Street. Now, some of the colour was was positive. Some of the colour was, well, shall we say, less positive. But nevertheless, it was colourful, that's for sure. But I think all of that's probably gone now because people lead much more constricted lives and, you know, people fit whatever the fashion may be, and the fashion of behaviour, which he tries to avoid colour if possible, but in the 40s, and certainly in the years before that, I think people let it all hang out, and people were fairly uninhibited. They expressed themselves, and certainly the Bilbys expressed themselves. Now, we had two advantages, I suppose. This is the Bilbys, when I add colour, but I've got colour on all sorts of people, I can tell you. But I'm going to give you a little bit of the Bilby colour to start with, so that it can't be said that I shield my own tribe from the sort of criticism or the observations that I may make of others. We had two advantages in that we had the numbers, because there were 3 Bilby houses there. One, a little more genteel than the others. Another, rather more overcrowded than the others. And ours with its own particular colour. And I dare say that most people in the district, in that area, thought we were feral. Not that we thought that. We thought we were sort of, well, certainly the cream of Lower King Street society, that's for sure. But I'm not so sure that was a popular view or a common view, even though we saw everyone else as being, well, slightly feral, that's for sure. So we had the numbers. And we didn't sort of deliberately let it be known, I think, but, you know, there was a certain, shall we say, genetic tendency to add colour. And the second advantage, of course, is that Bilby, as you may know if you follow the language, an old and one of the very oldest, we'll call it English names, because it derives from the Vikings, and so there have been Bilbys around up in Yorkshire to start with from the Viking times, probably from about 800, because it's a Viking name. And there aren't a great number of Viking names in English, but anyway, Bilby is an old Viking name. And, well, if we have the Viking name, we also have the Viking genes. And as you well know, the Vikings were a tempestuous mob of raiders and rapists and robbers and, you name it. There are TV shows, you know, called The Vikings and so on. And the Vikings are always raiding and killing and plundering and God only knows what not. Well, once you've got that gene, you know, it's very difficult to get rid of it. You can't just can't take a pill and get rid of the genes. So the Bilbies have tended to be, shall we say, individualists, and they've not been well known for being particularly socially cooperative. And so you won't really find the Bilbies in Charleville, at least, and elsewhere, in the annals of social cooperation. They tended to do their own thing. But anyway, that was us. And so whatever criticism I make, or not criticism, but whatever observations I may make about the rest of Lower King Street, I make them, in the full confession that we were among the more colourful, shall we say. And so there we are. Okay then. Well, I wonder, should I plunge in, and give the Bilby story? If you go to the Charleville Times of the early 1930s, there were lots and lots of reports of Jim Bilby, the pugilist, the fighter. Jim was one of our more colourful relatives. I think he was, I don't know whether he was the eldest son in that family or the second eldest son, but Jim was a noted pugilist, and he fought all over the district. He fought the Cunnamulla champions, the Corby champions, the Ogathilla champions, Tambo champions, and he was frequently written up in the Charleville Times. And so, as I say, the pugilism was, in him anyway, manifest, well and truly. And people used to go and pay to see him train in the town hall. And so he was, in that sense, fairly famous. Of course, he was famous for quite a number of other things too, which I hesitate to mention, but nevertheless. But he was certainly given to pugilism. But he was not the only one given to pugilism, because I think most of the boys were given to some sort of pugilism. I remember once talking to someone, I don't know who it was, probably a worthy of some kind, I don't know. And the worthy said to me, what's your name? And I said, Bilby. Ah, he said, the Fighting Bilbies. Well, of course, I was mortified because, by that time I had thought of myself in rather more elevated terms. But even though I may have thought of myself as being in elevated terms, that's not necessarily how the town saw us. Our own household, of course, was, people in Charleville, they used to go to the show every year. And, there'd be the horses and the cattle and the children's work and the vegetables and all that sort of thing, and the chooks. But there's also a sort of, I think they call it Sideshow Alley or something, and the most interesting place on the Sideshow Alley was the boxing tent. And so Charleville people used to go along and they'd see the boxing tent once a year maybe. But of course our home, it was like, we had it every week. Oh dear. Ours was an interesting home. There was very little that wasn't either broken or bent, because if you throw stuff, it tends to break. But if it's made of, we'll say, silver or cast iron or whatever, and it's thrown, it tends to bend a little bit. And so most things in our home were either broken or bent. And because Mum and Dad used to put on a pretty good show, regularly, I might add. And and then if you go down the road, well, the boys were down there, and the boys were often involved in a bit of pugilism. But we had an aunt, Edie. Now, Edie was a spitfire. Edie had red hair. Good. The Bilbies often, had red hair. Don had very red hair. I used to have a reddish beard, Well, I didn't have a beard, but if I had let it grow, it would have been red. But this is the Viking in us. Now, Edie, of course, had some of the Viking in her. Edie was a red-headed girl, smoked a fair bit, and she had the Bilby genes, and so she was a basketball player and thought herself to be a very fine basketball player indeed. And there had been a basketball team in town, but of course it's very difficult for the Bilbies to stay in any team for any great length of time. They break out And Edie broke out, and she formed a rival basketball team called the Rebels. Oh dear. And so, you know, even in the sporting field, there was a tendency for the Bilbies to break out. So when I give you observations of the rest of the areas that were called Bilby, Bilby, not Heights, Bilby, Lower Bilby, no, Lower King Street, you know, I make no criticism. I simply say that whatever they may have done, we did worse. Oh, I tell you. But, you know, it was a bit like Dickens, really. I don't think the world of Dickens exists anymore, but certainly it was Dickens in those days. But still. Anyway, let me go on to nicer things. I'm thinking about the social life in King Street, Lower King Street. I mean, the Lower King Street, from the point of view of social life, went from our place, you know, just opposite, near Frank Connolly's place, opposite the Turveys, and just down the road from the irrigation paddock, down to the corner, down to Pettiford's Corner, or we'll call it Pettiford's Corner, where the Pettifords lived. But in the summer, my father used to borrow my grandfather's old T-model utility, I suppose you'd call it. This was a very primitive utility. I don't know, in the 1920s or something like that. Not a car of any great quality. You know, it was one of those. It had a motor, then it had a cabin, and then it had a sort of tray at the back that you could get into or onto or whatever. And there, of course, those cars used to have running boards. And so usually, if you had a dog, the dog would learn to ride on the running board. But usually in summer, if there was any water in the river, we would be sent by our father to range down the street from our place down as far as Pettiford's, announcing to all and sundry that maybe about 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon we would be going swimming to the 2 Mile. And about the arranged time, the T-model Ford would begin from our place, and then it would slowly make its way down King Street as far as Pettiford's place on the corner, through the sand, because it was all sand in those days, picking up people who were intent upon joining the swimming party. And so this old T-model Ford, it had people riding on the mud guards, it had people riding on the running boards, as we call them. They were crowded into the back, and we may have had 15 or 20 people fitting into that. And so, you know, we would pick up people along the way, you know, from our place. Then maybe there's some from my grandmother's place, maybe someone at the Gordon's place. Then certainly the Pettifords used to put on a fair load of you know, girls and ladies, and so it was quite a big crowd. And so down to the 2 Mile we'd go, and you all know the way to the 2 Mile. You know where the old Union camp used to be, down that way, a bit beyond there. And so that was one aspect of recreation that we had, and that was sort of community thing. There were never any fights. Everyone got on quite well, and so there it was. Now, any other... Oh, yes, there's a bit of entertainment every now and then. I told you that the Gordons built a horsebreaking yard. Oh, within the shadow of the big tree, I can tell you. Sort of a circular yard, quite high fences. And the story would go around, you know, that this afternoon Paddy or Barney or whoever it may have been was going to break a horse. And we would go down and we'd sit on the rails, and I think a horse would be sort of ridden to a standstill. I only ever attended the horse breaking once, but it happened, you know, it was I don't know whether you'd call it a regular thing, but, you know, there was horse breaking entertainment, if you like, for sure. But I'm not quite sure. I think horse breaking meant, I don't know, I mean, you could define this as nicely and say like breaking in, but I had the impression that it was like breaking the spirit of the horse, because you rode it and beat it until it finally stopped bucking, and accepted the fact that it was going to be mastered by, one of the Gordons in all probability, I would have thought. Okay, now what else happened in that street? There were several other things happened in that street. We used to get a fruiterer, Tim Adams. Tim had a truck. He used to have his fruit displayed on the back of the truck, and he would come around. I don't know whether he came around once a week or whether he came around twice a week. Probably, if he was sensible, he probably only came once a week to our area, Tim was a lovely man, and he, was the fruiterer and came around in that truck of his for many years. And but I liked him. I thought he was a very good fellow, a very kind man, and may I say a forgiving man, because why he came into Beelby territory and into Lower King Street, I do not know, because one or two things happened. Well, we usually paid, and on the occasions we couldn't pay, we'd just say, we'll pay you next time, Tim, and Tim would write it in a book, and that's how things went. Of course, we had an aunt, an in-law, I might add, not of the blood. When Tim would come, she'd always bring the baby out, and the baby was always dressed in a smock. I suppose you call it a smock. You know how children in those days, there's all this smocking across here, but it was like a little dress, and she'd bring the baby out and she'd be nursing the baby, and Tim would be occupied on one side of the car and she'd be occupied on the other side, but she'd pinch a peach or two and hold it up under the baby's dress and stand there like an innocent mother. But in fact she'd been purloining Tim's fruit. We once tried to expose her, we called, Tim, she's pinching your fruit. Well, Tim, of course, remained poker-faced. What could he do? He was in Beelby territory after all. And, no, she said, I'm not pinching the fruit. We said, yes, you are. You got it up under the baby's dress. Well, she must have been mortified. I'm sure she probably felt like killing us. As it has happened, she didn't, But Tim chose to believe her. But he knew damn well why he continued to come and call at that particular house. I really do not know. But anyway, that's how it was. So there we are. What else was there in King Street in terms of entertainment? Not a great deal. Although it was a strange thing, If you went down to what we call Jackie Fagan's Corner, that's at the corner just beyond the big tree, the sand there was very, very thick, really thick sand at the side. There was a sort of a hardened track in the middle that cars could go down, but on the side it was very thick sand. But we discovered, obviously it would have been in summer, and I don't know whether it was always so, but we discovered, at one stage anyway, that if you dug down into that sand, in this arid area, and I don't know particularly if it was after rain or anything, but you'd come to frogs. There'd be frogs would bury themselves deep into that sand, and maybe they lay there in a sort of a comatose state until the next rain or something. But certainly you could find frogs there. And then in 1940, I don't know whether it was about 47, 48, something like that, there were two occasions when there was very heavy rain. And it was too heavy to go out in the rain, but up near the irrigation department, there was a track on the footpath, we'll call it a footpath, that went between the galvanised burr. And but if we found on two occasions there little fish, like little what are they, bobbies, I think we used to call them, swimming along the footpath. Well, we vowed and declared that they came down with the rain, and people said, oh, no, they must have swum from the river. Well, they were mighty fast swimmers, I can tell you, if that was so. I mean, you know where Gowrie Crossing is, and you know where King Street is and West Street is. Some people have said they came up from the gully, but the gully usually in that area had no water in it at all. There used to be a little pool down there near the cemetery, but we used to get crayfish, but gee, that was a tiny little pool, I can tell you. You'd walk across in about 3 or 4 paces. So I don't know. I continued to believe that they came down in the rain. And one of the reasons that I think they did come down in the rain, is that it must have been after the 1947 hailstorm. Now, Kathleen Harriman, Kathleen was in our class, and but she somehow or another had the entree to Commono's shop. Now, there's a Commono's building opposite the School of Arts. And, yes, Commono's must have been there at that time. But somehow or another, Kathleen had the entree to this particular building. And she announced to me at school that during that great hailstorm, coral had fallen from the sky. Well, you'd think, I can believe fish would fall from the sky, but coral, no, that's pushing it a bit. And but nevertheless, she took me. If you go up to the back of that building, there's 2 levels of that Commono's building. If you go to the back of the building, there's a sort of I don't know what you'd call it, a sun deck or something like that, at the back on the upper level. She took me up there, and there was still a great heap of ice there from the hailstorm, but nevertheless, in the middle of it, there was a great chunk of white coral. Well, if the chunk of white coral had always been there, why would they manufacture a story about it? But they declared that it had come down with the ice in the hailstorm. And so, I saw it with my own eyes. And how it happened, I don't know. But it apparently did. Otherwise, a lot of people were telling terrible lies. There was another occasion also, about that time, I think, at the bottom of Alfred Street, there's a bit of there must be a bit of a angle there where the Cunnamulla Road goes along, where Alfred Street becomes Old Cunnamulla Road. There was a family there called Hawthorne, and news went around the school that these little fish that had fallen from the sky were to be found in Hawthorne's laundry, because they had a laundry that had a sort of cement base and it retained the water. Well, in those days, everyone had the entree to everything, and so if there was a story going around that there were these little fish to be found swimming around in Hawthorne's laundry, around you went. And, well, Hawthorne's obviously didn't object, but, everyone had the entree to everything those days. But nevertheless, there was another place in town where these fish appeared. Now, that was a little closer to the river, of course, but they were the same kind of fish that appeared on that footpath outside what became the irrigation department in King Street. Okay, well, now let me have a look. Yes, I mentioned that the last droving expedition, I suppose you might call it, was, in about 1947 or whatever, around there. But the departure was one of some fanfare. We knew that Barney, I think it was going to go, Barney Gordon was going to go out on this great droving trip. And, he had the wagon and the horses and God only knows what not. I don't know whether he was picking up the sheep or cattle. But, it was due, the departure was due to go at about, we'll say 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, whatever it may have been. And, we went down to farewell it. It was a ceremony of some kind. The droving group was to begin. But of course that wasn't the only thing, You didn't just go and farewell the droving expedition, if you like. In those days, certainly in the... this was in the 40s, and no doubt it had been a practice in Charleville ever since since 1889 when the train came. But you would go to meet the train. Now, nothing much happened in Charleville as well, Now, unless the Bilbys were involved in a brawl or a theft or a fight or, whatever it may have been. And so, if life was dull, well, you went to meet the train. You got dressed up and up you went. You probably didn't buy a platform ticket that you were supposed to buy, but you'd go up and you'd meet the train. Well, you were fairly optimistic you went to meet the train because no one ever knew when the train was getting in. It was supposed to get in. The Western Mail was due in Charleville at 12:30 on a Saturday. It never did. It was a curious arrangement. It was frequently late, and I remember once it was supposed to be on time, and Charleville 4VL had a fanfare to announce that the train was on time. Oh, they had trumpets and all that sort of thing. Oh, what an event. It had never happened in the life of the town before. And but anyway, it was late. But I was on that train once, and I seemed to get an explanation of it. There was overtime. Anyway, I was on the train, and we got out, the Scour, out about 4 miles out of town there, east of Charleville. The train came to a standstill for no apparent reason. And we sat there, and we sat there, and we sat there. I don't know how long we sat there for. The train did not move. Anyway, after an appropriate time, maybe in an hour or two, whatever it could have been, the train chose to move into Charleville several hours late, and the driver and the staff, of course, were entitled to enormous overtime. Well, you wouldn't get away with that today, but of course you could just stop the train out of town and clock up a couple of hours of overtime. So there we are. But yes, you go and meet the train, and you got dressed up. I remember Uncle Ron, he had this sort of fuzzy, reddish sort of hair, and he used to wear a pork pie hat at an angle, very rakish arrangement. Where are you going, Uncle Ron? Uncle Jim went to the court, where he was determined to find the fellow not guilty anyway, regardless of the evidence. Well, Uncle Ron had this pork pie hat, and he was going to meet the train. Well, we never went to meet the train because my mother saw herself as a lady of quality. I don't know that other people did, but nevertheless, Mum did think of herself as a lady of quality, and certainly above the fray. And although she entered the fray often enough because she was a pretty good shot with a silver vase, a plaster of Paris duck, jam tin. Oh, she was accurate, very, very accurate. Anyway, she disapproved of these curious local habits. Oh dear, there were so many things we didn't do, because Mum disapproved of the feral ways. But there we are. Okay then, so you met the train. Oh yes, King Street, it was interesting. It was a very sandy sort of street, And every now and then, uncles, I suppose they must have been uncles, would borrow my grandfather's old utility. Well, when you drove, you drove with flair. And you had to know the peculiarities of the driving flair. I used to be walking down the road, in the sand towards Gordon's place, probably going down to see whether Sarah had baked any brownies. But you had to know that if one of the Bilbys was coming down that street in that car, and he had to turn left there was a spare Bilby yard between grandfather's place and the Gordon's place. Well, you didn't just make a 90-degree turn, you did an arabesque, and you swerved out onto the other side of the road, and then you circled in. And you didn't have to do that, but it was part of the style. If you just an ordinary left-hand turn, just a 90-degree turn, it had no style at all. And so there we are. And then up the other, in the yard beside us, this is Frank Connolly's yard, after Frank stopped his poultry business or whatever it may have been, there's a fellow called Reggie Whipps. Reggie Whipps used to come out from Toowoomba or wherever it may have been, because in those days there were great flocks of galahs. Hundreds and hundreds of galahs would be in great flocks. And they would come into Frank Connolly's yard because it had burrs or seeds that they liked particularly. And Reggie used to come out there, and he had a great big sort of wheel iron hoop with wire over the top of it. And he would stick a stick up under one end of it and maybe put a bit of wheat under it. And then when enough galahs had gathered on it, he'd pull the stick and he would capture, 20, 30, 40, whatever it may have been, galahs. And he would cage them, and he would take them down to Brisbane. He must have had a truck. I don't think they'd have let him take it on the train. But he used to take these galahs down to Toowoomba, and he would sell them. And they were all guaranteed to talk. And as you well know, a young galah is a very pale colour, and an old galah is a very dark colour, blood red, sort of red velvet type of thing. And they'd say, well, this galah big talk. Oh, yes, it will talk wonderfully. Well, of course, Reggie was... he did a very good business. But anyway, that was in the yard next door. Now, where did I move a little bit further down here? Oh, yes. I mentioned the tailors, the tailors and their trees. And I said that Nita used to discipline Yvonne and Deirdre. Now, of course, they must have got great entertainment from the missiles that used to, fly across our yard. Mum on one side, Dad on the other side. And God only knows what story they would have told. The colour of it all, I can tell you. Meanwhile, we sort of learned to dodge or take refuge or whatever. I don't really know. In wartime, I suppose one learns to cope. Well, we sort of learned to cope, and we knew how to dodge the missiles and all that sort of thing. I don't know that Mum did. I don't know that Dad did, but nevertheless, because they're pretty accurate in their aim. But excuse me, but we used to be quite amused because Anita was older than Yvonne and Deirdre, and as I say, she used to have to discipline them from time to time. Now, we could stand in our back landing, and you'd see Yvonne dashing out one door onto the veranda, and then you'd see Yvonne or Deirdre dashing at the other, and then would come Nita, and she always had a plastic or one of those, imitation mother of pearl or whatever it might have been, hairbrushes. And she would be pursuing them with this hairbrush because they were going to cop it on the arse with this hairbrush. I mean, be disciplined with a hairbrush on the arse. We would have thought it was very feet business, that's for sure. No, we would have heard something rather more robust, I can assure you of that. Okay then, now let me see, we've got Reggie Whips, and now let me see. Meeting the train. There was a tree there, The council cut it down. I was very sorry about that. At the corner of King Street and May Street, May, of course, named after one of the early surveyors. Mr. May might have been the Commissioner of Crown Lands there for a while, otherwise he was just a surveyor in town. And then Carter, of course, was H.M. Carter, of the first town plan, survey plan. That's Carter Street. But there's a tree there called, my grandmother always called it a pin tree. Very unusual tree. I've never seen another tree like it. And I never saw another tree like it in town. My grandmother called it a pin tree. I try to find what that tree was on the internet, but I can never find anything that, that seems to equate to the pin tree. But it had a very thick bark, as you might have expected a tree that, of which you sold the bark. I don't really know. It was not a beautiful tree at all, but it was quite a big tree. But it was a very unusual tree. And just as they never cut down the big tree outside Gordon's, I don't know why on earth they cut down the tree in May Street, because they could easily, the street was very wide, and they put bitumen on either side, but they cut down this tree. And I just thought that was a very strange thing. Okay, then now let me see. Oh, yes, a little bit of the scandal. Now, I told you about Elsie Turvey and Bill Turvey. In later years, this is in the late 40s, beginning 50s, Bill got a girlfriend. He had, I think he no longer found romance with Elsie, shall we say. But he certainly found romance with Lily Williams. Now, Lily was reputed to run a business. I think she had run a business probably from, uptown somewhere, I think, maybe. I'm not quite sure. But certainly she established her business at Turvey's place. Well, this would have called for a certain degree of forgiveness on Elsie's part, because there was only one bed. And, but, we used to have people knocking on our door, I might add, saying, where does Lily Williams live? And, well, Lily Williams lived over the road, but we took some objection to being a sort of port of call for people to make inquiries of where Lily the Pro might have been involved. But anyway, Lily had a business there. And anyway, well, I don't know whether Bill provided accommodation or whether Bill availed himself for free Of the services, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, eventually Lily died, and probably from grog, I would have thought. But, you know, there was romance in that area. Now, well, I'll have a look and just see what else I've got there. Oh, yes. A curious little thing. There was a family over the back called the Prides living there. I think Mr. Pride must have been working for the post office or something like that, because there were two children. One was called Ken and one was called Dorothy. And Ken was given to interest in electrical things, and when there was a fete, Ken used to take some sort of dynamo, and if you, it must have been part of a phone, I think, and you turn the handle and an electrical charge would be generated, and if you paid threepence, you could join a line of people who would get the shock. Someone would hold a wire, then there'd be a line of people, and Ken would wind the handle, and, well, for threepence you could have an electric shock, and so, a curious thing. But anyway, there we are, people paid. They were fetes, though. Those fetes were very good. They must have been the Catholic fetes sometimes, I think, because they had the bingo. Not only did they have the bingo, they had the red, white and blue. 2 to 1 on the red and white, 3 to 1 on the blue. Argus Watt used to on that. I remember. 2 to 1 the red and white, 3 to 1 the blue. And there used to be a band rotunda there in that beside the town hall. And well, you know, no age limits. I would have been not even in my teens, and I'd go along and put my money on 2 to 1 the red and white, 3 to 1 the blue. And Argus Watt was perfectly happy to take the money. Sometimes I won, sometimes I didn't. Let me have a look. I've got that one, I've got that one, I've got that one. Here's over here. Now, let me see. Oh, yes, I must hurry, because time moves on. Goats. There were a lot of goats in town, you know, in the early part. Goodman's on the corner. They were on the corner of Parry and West Streets, diagonally opposite Uncle Tom Bilby. Uncle Tom had a small flock of goats, but Goodman's had the really big flock of goats. And, all they do is covered in goat pills. And so that would have been into the 40s, in later 40s, I would have thought. 47 seemed to have been a sort of, tidal year. The tide either passed or came in or whatever about that time. That, I think I told you, that was the time. The goats came to grief. I mean, there was no milk. There was no milk. Fresh milk was hard to get. But the Goodmans had these big flock of goats. Uncle Tom had a smaller flock. But they came to grief because the goats, Akak Baker used to live up in the next block above West Street. Akak was the mayor. And the goats jumped up one night into the back of his utility and ate the canvas hood, and, well, goats were banned after that. But strangely enough, I think in the 30s at least, the council decided that they're going to improve the quality of the goat in the town. And it was said that they bought 2 stinkers, one stinker for the northern end of town and one stinker for the southern end of town. But I think there may have only been one stinker, because I don't know that those stinkers would have observed any rule of, not trespassing upon one another's property beyond Wool Street. I only ever saw the stinker once, and I think it was the stinker rather than the 2 stinkers. But one of the that stinker anyway, came down to our end of town, and as I said, and stinker was certainly the word for it. And but anyway, the time I saw it, the stinker met a ram. Now the stinker had great horns, the ram had great horns, and they clashed outside Turvey's place. And they fought and clashed one another for hours, rearing up and smashing their heads together. And it was entertaining in its own way, but it was the only time I saw it. But prior to Akak, the council had been solicitous of the quality of the goat in the town. Now let me see. We've got the goats, the horses, Uncle Tom's and Goodman's. In the next block up from us, I can't really tell you anything very much. The families there, Bradley's, the Browns, Jeannie Brown was on that corner. The Kennedys were there. They had a high house there on the even summer side. And on the corner of West and King Street, on the even-numbered side, on that corner. I can't remember. I thought they could have been. That could have been the Davidsons. I can't quite sure. But they were also horsey people, and they had stables, and they were also involved in, with racehorses, which our pig used to visit from time to time. And let me see. There are other stories that I could tell. Oh, yes. There's a family here that I was always quite interested in. I've looked up this family on the internet, and I can never find anything about them. But in your mind, you come across these contradictions, and the contradictions involved what you thought this family was like, and then something that turns up later on that tells you that your judgment must have been off, shall we say. There was a family living in Paris Street, up from the corner, that'll be on the odd number side of the street, about 2 or 3 allotments up from the corner of West and Paris Street, called the Marises. Now, the Marises, as I recall, were a fairly big family. I don't think they were rich. And we weren't rich either, but we somehow or another saw ourselves as being superior for, I don't know what reason we did, but we certainly thought we were a cut above the others. But in the same way, they probably thought they were a cut above us too. But anyway, the Marises were a big family, and we thought of them as being a little bit feral. A little bit sort of outre, shall we say. But of course that was my fault, because the judgments we made were judgments made on our prejudices and so on. And the reason that this contradiction was this: Johnny Maris was in our class, and I'd love to know, if only I could go back in time and find Johnny Maris. Any of the Marises, but Johnny Maris in particular. Now, Johnny Maris was in our class. Johnny had a strange voice, a very nasalised sort of voice, and it's what he used to do or did a couple of times in class that caused me in later years, many years later, to think, how could this have happened? The teachers in those days used to do strange things. Every now and then, I think when they were in desperation or something, they would announce that tomorrow was going to be Own Choice Poetry Day, and you had to bring along a poem of your own choice. Well, we had no books in our house, and books were unknown. Never a book passed through our gate other than the school textbook. Certainly books were unknown in my grandfather's place, and I don't think Uncle Jack had many books in his house. But books how were we bloody well going to find an own choice poem? I don't know what I did, but anyway. But nevertheless, Johnny Maris would come along, and Johnny Maris would recite this poem. All along the backwater, through the rushes tall, ducks are all a-dabbling, up-tails all. Blah, 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 or something, a quiver, and so on and on. And I used to be quite intrigued by this poem, because Johnny used to read it very, very well. And it was only about, I don't know, maybe... No, not even 20 years later, maybe 15 years later, I finally got round to reading Wind in the Willows. Lo and behold, this particular poem was from Wind in the Willows. Now, I ask you, how was it that this was about, let me see, that's 43, 44, 45, 46, about 46 or 47, Johnny Maris was able to... What's going on here? We've got this light. There's a heavenly light behind me, Maybe I've been taken and I've gone to heaven. I really do not know. But there seems to be a heavenly light behind me. Oh dear, wait a minute. Look, I'll just check. I might be gone. Just one moment. Well, here I am. Why don't you move this around? I don't really want that there. You can have me at an angle. No, I wasn't taken. I thought I may have been taken, and I thought that it could have been the heavenly light. But anyway, let me get back to the Marises. When I was about 20, for the first time I came across Wind in the Willows, and lo and behold, here was this, all along the backwater through the rushes shawl. That was a poem that we could never have gone to school to tell. That family that I thought was a feral family had books. Who gave Johnny access to that poem? And obviously it was someone within his home. And so while I anyway, may have thought of the Marises as a feral family, they clearly were not. That's why I'd love to meet the Marises. Now, of course, I talk at 84. And most of the people I talk about will either be dead or nearly dead or long since dead, whatever it may have been. And so all my wishes for what I could have found out about the past are not going to come to anything very much at all. But I'd love to know how Johnny Maris was able to say that poem. Maybe, like my mother, Mrs. Maris may have been a lady of some quality who came out into the West, maybe got duffed or whatever, and so remained. But somebody in that home, in the early 40s, in about 45, 46, 47, whatever it may have been, had read Wind in the Willows, had a copy of Wind in the Willows, and that told me that that family was not the family, in fact, that I thought they were, because there was some real quality in that family, and I'd like to know where it came from. I suspect it must have been from the mother, maybe. Not that that did them any good in terms of, the feral attitudes that I had towards people in those days. And, only subsequently, as I grew older, that I came to find that many of the judgments that I made in Bilby terms and in Lower King Street terms were pretty inaccurate. And, like Mrs. Bailey, as I mentioned. But I'd love to know how Johnny Maris knew that story. But it told that there were qualities in that family that I never recognised, and probably most people didn't recognise. But look, Johnny is probably dead now because he may not be dead. But boy, would I like to hear from the Marises to find out how it was that Johnny knew that poem, because that family obviously had qualities that we did not have, even with all of our wonderful Viking breeding. So there we are. That's a bit of the dirt on the town, but it's true.